The past has left us with gigantic puzzles, and this is meant quite literally. In the distant past, our ancestors created colossal monumental buildings that inevitably raised the question, how was this even possible? How did people thousands of years ago manage to carve stone giants out of the ground that even our most modern construction machines would have despaired of? Could it be that the peoples of antiquity had more than the simple means and tools that are commonly attributed to them? Some alternative minds take these questions even further. Was it perhaps not the people who built the pyramids and the like? No matter where we turn our historical gaze, it seems that practically every corner of this world is adorned with architectural giants that leave us with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. And an ancient site in Turkey, which has always been overshadowed by huge question marks, proves that the ancient penchant for a megalomania did not begin with the era of the ancient Egyptians. Located in southeastern Anatolia, the roots of Göbekli Tepe go back at least 11,600 years, and massive T-pillars weighing between 8 and 10 tons lie dormant here. It is in the nature of things that the processing and placement of these massive loads required a high degree of knowledge and coordination, and yet a look beyond the archaeological horizon shows that it was always possible to go even bigger. Accordingly, significantly more imposing structures were built in the following millennia, almost transforming the structures of Göbekli Tepe into puny Lego bricks. The Greeks, the Romans, the Maya, and the Incans have left us silent witnesses to time that still take our breath away today. But when it comes to the mystery of ancient gigantic structures, the ancient Egyptians are probably the prime example par excellence. And that doesn't just mean the famous pyramids of Giza. No, the statues, temples, and obelisks also leave many modern researchers largely baffled. A perplexity that is primarily due to the fact that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire did not keep comprehensive records of their building techniques, which seems all the more puzzling when we remember that they otherwise recorded practically everything for posterity. In the absence of solid archaeological evidence, experts have no choice but to delve into the field of theories. So how could the Egyptians have moved their blocks of stone weighing tons, and how did they pile them up to create architectural masterpieces? Well, the conventional wisdom among researchers is that the fathers of the pyramids used boats to move the extreme loads from A to B. When it comes to transportation on land, they are said to have used large wooden sledges that were moved with the help of hundreds or even thousands of workers. At the actual ancient construction site, sophisticated ramp systems were then used, which allowed the individual components to be maneuvered upwards and assembled with unparalleled precision to form a monumental structure. In theory, these explanations sound quite conclusive. But in practice, most of the ancient Egyptian construction methods and tools disappeared into the oblivion of the past. But we should not forget one thing. Roman colossal buildings by no means needed to hide from their ancient Egyptian counterparts. In fact, the Romans used some of the largest known blocks of stone in their sites, and added a number of tantalizing entries to the list of archaeological mysteries. How did the Romans plan to move this 1,000-ton object? You have to think about it. Made in the quarry of Baalbek, in present-day Lebanon, the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman is more than 20 meters long, around 5 meters wide, over 4 meters high, and weighs in, at the bottom line, the equivalent of almost 170 African elephants. In view of these extreme dimensions, the following is all the more astonishing. The two other monoliths found at the same site are even more massive. In detail, the weight of the nameless stones is put at 1,240 and 1,650 tons respectively, and they embody no less than some of the largest man-made stones of all time. But why, and above all, how did the Romans want to transport these monsters from the quarry? And what ancient building project required such gigantic blocks? Well, when it comes to the question of the intended use, the experts are unanimous. The conventional wisdom is that the stone colossi were intended for the temple complex at Baalbek. No wonder, since the complex is known for its awe-inspiring giganticism anyway. It is home to some of the largest Roman buildings in the Middle East. Just take a look at the almost ridiculously large stones that form the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter, In the corresponding photos, the people in the foreground almost look like tiny ants. It is obvious that the Romans were able to move loads of this size, but experts can only speculate about the transportation of the megaliths mentioned above. And this despite the fact that there is actually a historical source that provides a deep insight into the secrets of Roman architecture. The Roman military technician and engineer Marcus Vitruvius bequeathed the collective work De Architectura Libri Decim to posterity. As the only surviving work of architectural theory from antiquity, the 10 Books on Architecture reveal the background to temples, houses, and cities. At the same time, we also know of several contemporary depictions that show how the Romans used constructions made of winches, hoists, and cranes to realize their ambitious building projects. In the case of particularly large blocks, the theory goes, they may have used several cranes at the same time. In terms of transportation, however, historians point to rollers or sledges. But wouldn't these have instantly broke under the sheer weight of the pregnant woman's stone or sunk into the sandy ground? Well, that's not far-fetched. Despite this, the experts emphasize that even hundreds of years ago, it was perfectly possible to transport extremely large stones over long distances without the use of lost technologies or extraterrestrial aids, mind you. The obelisk in St. Peter's Square, which was moved to its new location in 1586 with the help of 900 workers, 150 horses, and 47 winches, is often cited in this regard. However, it should perhaps be noted at this point that the rose granite monolith only weighs 320 tons and is therefore almost 700 tons lighter than the stone of the pregnant woman. Well, perhaps this is precisely the reason why the stone colossi still lie dormant in the Baalbek quarry and do not adorn an overwhelming monumental temple. The Romans had to admit to themselves that they had overreached themselves and left unfinished business. Do the buildings of antiquity bear witness to an unbelievable truth? Now there is a, well, slightly more alternative camp that is not quite so easily fobbed off with this answer. The idea that the Romans dramatically misjudged their building project simply doesn't seem plausible. The idea that our ancient ancestors were regularly visited by aliens would be a little more plausible. Where the theories of ramps and sheer muscle power have had their day, extraterrestrial beings come into play, who were worshipped as supernatural deities by the inhabitants of Earth. In return, the exotic visitors revealed advanced technologies to humans, which made the creation of the monumental buildings possible in the first place. But what kind of technologies were these? Well, even in the alternative scene, this is not clear. But the bottom line is that the consensus is that they functioned very differently from our modern machines. There is sometimes talk of implosions and the power of sound. For example, the tradition that the Egyptian priests sang while building the pyramids is interpreted to mean that the blocks, which weighed tons, were moved with the help of acoustics. But how much truth is there in these unusual theories? Couldn't the gigantic loads have been moved and worked in a way that doesn't shatter our conventional view of history? Well, to get to the bottom of this question, a research team decided without further ado to put the matter to a practical test. A few years ago in Massachusetts, the participants set themselves the task of lifting a granite obelisk that the sculptor, Rick Brown, had made especially for this purpose. In detail, the researchers used a construction made of a ramp and sand, and while the sand was gradually removed, the obelisk slowly lowered into its intended position. And lo and behold, this simple yet clever method proved to be extremely effective. In the end, the men and women also managed to overcome the final inclination of 15 degrees using pure muscle power, and to raise the obelisk completely. However, another modern experiment shows that the Romans and Egyptians at least needed a lot of patience to maneuver their oversized components from A to B. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art produced an installation that goes by the name of Levitated Mass. While the free-floating mass weighs a considerable 340 tons, the first task was to bring the 6.55-meter-high boulder from the Juruper Valley Quarry 170 kilometers away to LA. And to accomplish this, a specifically designed truck had to be built around the stone monster. And here's the thing, The vehicle was 80 meters long, 9.75 meters wide, and had 196 wheels. As just mentioned, the Sigiriya rock fortress can look back on over 1,500 years of history. And yet, this is only half the historical truth. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that human settlement in the region did not begin with the construction of the fortress, but 3,500 years earlier. In the course of time, in the 3rd century BC to be precise, some Buddhist monks also settled in the surrounding area. But to understand what the time-honored ruins, which were declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, are all about, we have to turn the wheel of time forward another 2 centuries. Because although the monolith, around 200 meters high, is not what we would describe as an easily accessible place at first glance, it does have one decisive advantage. It is difficult for enemies to reach, and it provides a perfect panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. But first things first. In 473 AD, King Dahasunena of Anuradhapura had been in power for almost 20 years. Dahasunena's rightful heir to the throne was his son Moggallana, although the ruler had another descendant. However, as Kassapa had been fathered by one of the king's concubines, he had to take second place in the line of succession. But as we all know, human greed for power is sometimes greater than the love of one's own family. And so it came to pass that Kassapa killed his father and then ascended the throne. However, the regicide knew that his deed would not go unpunished. He feared Moggallana's revenge and had a secluded fortress built that was beyond the reach of his half-brother, the rock city of Sigiriya. In the new capital of the empire, Kassapa managed to remain in power for around 20 years before his fate finally caught up with him in 491. His half-brother, who had been exiled to South India, gathered a huge army around him and engaged his father's murderer in a final decisive battle. In the end, Moggallana was victorious. The new king declared Anuradhapura the capital again, and Sigiriya functioned as a Buddhist monastery until the 15th century. After the time of the monks, the king of Kandy was able to seek refuge in the fortress in the event of an emergency. In our western latitudes, however, we have only known of the existence of the legendary rock city since the late 19th century. At that time, British researchers were able to bring the ruins of Sigiriya back to archaeological reality with all their breathtaking contemporary evidence. Of stone lions and revealing images. But why is the site known by the name Sigiriya of all names? Well, there's a very simple reason. This name is derived from Singha Giri, which means nothing other than Lion Rock, and alludes to the colossal guardian that every visitor once had to pass through. In detail, visitors had to pass through the mouth of a stone lion, which at the time was enthroned on a plateau on the northern side of the rock. Today, however, only the paws of the big cat remain, and yet its dimensions still bear witness to the awe-inspiring sight the Lion Gate must have once offered. Furthermore, the imposing gate also gives the idea that Sigiriya was anything but a functional shelter that offered no amenities. In truth, the Lion City was not a desolate place whose everyday life was determined by the fear of omnipresent danger, but a thriving haven of life. Let's just take a look at the impressive Fountain Garden. It still bears witness to the extraordinary skills of its builders and is considered a prime example of ancient engineering. The ingenious system of wells, canals, lakes, and dams ensure that there was never a shortage of drinking water, even in the event of a prolonged siege. But that's not all. Some of these structures still function to this day, and they suggest that the builders of the time were generations ahead of their time. And even if some of Sigiriya's buildings have not managed to withstand the gnawing ravages of time, their remains provide a deep insight into the reality of life for the former inhabitants. Magnificent palaces greeted visitors high up on the rock, but today only the foundations remain. The reason for this is that the magnificent buildings were not made of solid stone, but of wood, which has weathered over time. Less weathered, but all the more wicked, is the case of the so-called Cloud Girls. These are detailed frescoes that line the ascent to the monolith, and are made up of bare-chested women. A contemporary inscription tells us that there were once 500 of these revealing works of art. Today, visitors can still marvel at 22 of them. However, the fact that they were damaged by unknown persons in 1967 shows that not everyone appreciates these irreplaceable testimonies to the times. In the 1970s, the Sri Lankan government then decided to restore some of the Cloud Girls and give them kind of a breast lift at the same time. In fact, some of the nipples were subsequently drawn slightly higher than originally. Incidentally, the 22 preserved frescoes have managed to survive all these centuries as they are located in a particularly protected spot. The corresponding rock niche is situated in such a way that it cannot be reached by the heavy rains. However, anyone visiting Sigiriya and thinking of taking photos of the works of art should be careful, because it is strictly forbidden for tourists to photograph the Cloud Girls. As a rule, graffiti spraying is also strictly forbidden. However, the graffiti that adorns the so-called mirror wall of Sigiriya is not a real nuisance for archaeologists, but an invaluable testimony to the times. It goes without saying that we are not dealing with any urban works of art here, but with the oldest known evidence of Sinhalese poetry ever. Created between the 7th and 11th centuries, the deciphering of the mirror wall also played a decisive role in the research of the Sinhalese language. The content of the graffiti deals with the Cloud Girls, which is also how we know that 500 of the painted beauties once existed. But what does the name mirror wall actually mean? Did a huge mirror hang here hundreds of years ago in which the inhabitants could admire themselves? Well, it wasn't quite like that, but something like that. The name goes back to the fact that the plastered walls were always polished to a high gloss in the days of the king, and thus allowed the ruler to admire his own face. The work of the gods? We have already told you about the background of the construction of Sigiriya. But the bottom line is that the local population has a completely different, far more spectacular version. The Lion City was by no means created by ordinary people, but by supernatural deities. But what is this exciting myth all about? Well, the divine creatures are said to have descended to Earth from time to time, and in order to have a proper residence here too, they built the imposing complex on the top of the rock. In detail, Sigiriya is said to have been modeled on the home of Kubera, who embodies the god of wealth, merchants, and treasures in mythology. And here's the thing, the Lion City is also said to have once had a magical palace that built a direct bridge between the world of the gods and our own. The year is 1985, when Japanese diving instructor Kiichiro Arataki ventures into the underwater world off the island of Yonaguni to open up new diving sites for tourists. But instead of exotic sea creatures and fascinating underwater plants, he saw something that has divided the research world into two camps ever since. A huge, strange-looking rock platform that was apparently man-made. Now, you might think that the discovery of a sunken archaeological site is quite spectacular, but not necessarily groundbreaking. However, this changes abruptly when we consider the following. The area in question has been underwater for a whopping 8,000 years. While the enigmatic structure is around 200 meters long and 150 meters wide, this raises a fundamental question. Who built it? Who was capable of mastering such a challenging project at a time when mankind was still in the infancy of civilization? Well, conservative researchers, who are notoriously reluctant to leave the confines of official historiography, answer this question as follows. It was Mother Nature. For although the so-called Yonaguni monument boasts astounding precision and astonishingly straight lines, it is said to merely be a natural erosion platform. On the other hand, there is the assumption that we are dealing with the stone traces of a completely unknown culture. An assumption that is held by a certain Graham Hancock. If you watch our videos regularly, you will know that the British alternative researcher is firmly convinced that a highly developed civilization lived on Earth long before our time. However, the ancient high-tech people were completely wiped out by a global flood disaster at the end of the last ice age. Well, at least almost, because a few people are said to have managed to escape annihilation and spread their advanced knowledge to the rest of the world. In the rest of the long-established research world, however, this hypothesis is not really welcomed with open arms. It is generally dismissed as utter nonsense. No wonder, the assumption that the Yonaguni monument was an artificial origin also stands in stark contrast to the current consensus. This states that at the time, only simple hunter-gatherers lived in the southwest of Japan who simply could not afford a construction project of this magnitude. Despite all this, Hancock does not back down from his unconventional opinion, and he is not alone. Geologist Masaki Kimura from Ryukyu University and Indian marine archaeologist Sri Sundaresh also have their problems with the erosion platform theory. After studying the ominous structure in detail, the experts pointed out, among other things, 2 megaliths with astonishingly straight lines and a trench with 2 90-degree angles. In view of the fact that the Yonaguni Monument now lies around 25 meters below the surface of the water, Kimura estimates that the shadowy builder culture must have existed around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and it was by no means a loosely connected group, but a fully fledged, advanced civilization. Officially, however, the Sumerians are still regarded as the first people to reach this civilizational milestone. The creators of cuneiform writing and artificial irrigation lived in southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC, 3,000 to 5,000 years after the supposed builders of the Yonaguni Monument. Despite all the exciting alternative beliefs, we should not leave one thing unmentioned. There are also critical dissenting voices, even from the otherwise skeptical camp. Geologist Robert Schoch, for example, is best known for his controversial redating of the Great Sphinx of Giza. In view of the conspicuous traces of water erosion, Schoch came to the conclusion that the statue must actually be several millennia older than generally assumed. In the case of the Yonaguni Monument, however, the Boston University professor is of the opinion that we are dealing with a natural geological formation. Well, with one small caveat. It is conceivable that the locals have polished parts of the rock to make it appear artificial. This floating monolith is a huge mystery. From the mysterious underwater world back to the surface, in Hyogo Prefecture, near the town of Takasago, sits a stone structure that is no less enigmatic than the Yonaguni Monument. In detail, it is a monolith almost 6 meters high and weighing an estimated 500 tons, which goes by the name of Isho no Hoden. However, there are a few factors that make this silent witness to history so much more than just an ordinary lump of rock. On the one hand, there are almost ridiculously straight edges, and on the other, it looks as if the massive load is floating above the surface of the water. However, this is not due to a mythical levitation technique, but to the column in the middle of the base, which appears invisible at first glance. Researchers generally assume that the megalith was never completed, but was left where it was carved. The Shinto Temple is located not far from the Colossus, and there is a simple reason for this. Ishi no Hoden has been revered as a shrine for centuries. But what is the background of this object? What do we know about its builders and its intended use? Well, the official version says that the rock was probably intended as a grave. This is a perfectly plausible assessment, but there is a small but crucial catch. There is simply no solid evidence for this. However, there is also no solid evidence for the theory that the precise side edges of the rock were carved with the tools we know. Such traces of working are only visible under the megalith, at the point where it is attached to a larger boulder. Geologists often explain the absence of such traces with erosion, but Ishi no Hoden was covered with rubble for a long time. With this in mind, one could be forgiven for thinking that the structure was not shaped using simple tools such as pickaxes and chisels. But how could it have been created? Well, the short and sweet answer is, we don't know. The only thing that is certain is that the rock and the surrounding rock were subjected to a series of modern laser measurements in 2005 and 2006. The experts came to the conclusion that Ishi no Hoden consists of hyaloclastite, a special volcanic form of rock that was formed around 70 million years ago. Many an alternative mind quickly thinks of ancient lasers and other high technologies in light of this. But in this case too, the clear evidence has yet to emerge. The same also applies to the contemporary reports on the creation of the boulder, although Ishi no Hoden is already mentioned in the Harama Fudokai, whose roots go back to the year 713 AD. The reason for its creation and the construction techniques used are not mentioned at all. Is the truth hidden in the fantastic legends? If Graham Hancock and company have their way, we would be well advised not to regulate the myths of our ancestors to the realm of fictional fairy tales, but rather to regard them as the result of a real memory. No wonder, after all, one of the British author's main arguments is based on the mysterious similarities and the legendary traditions of the various peoples. After all, practically every people knew the story of an all-destroying flood that brought forth higher beings with extraordinary knowledge. While, according to Hancock, these stories reveal the true background of the presumed precursor civilization, the question arises as to whether the mythological bridge can also be built to the Ishu no Hoden. So, let's take a closer look at the matter. Basically, the records from the Shinto shrine mentioned above tell us that the Kami Okanushi once ruled the land over Izumo in what is now Shimane Prefecture. A brief classification. In Shintoism, kami are reversed spirits or gods. While the concrete translation of the term into German is quite tricky, it is clear that at the Shinto religion, there is an ancient connection between the kami and severe waves of disease, droughts, and floods. Seen through the historical lens of Hancock, the question therefore arises as to whether the defined figures also emerged this time after a devastating catastrophe, and in reality embody the survivors of the predecessor culture. And we remember, the collectively forgotten people are said to have perished at the end of the last ice age. And lo and behold, some archaeological finds indicate that the belief in and worship of the kami gods goes back deep into the Jomon period. The prehistory of Japan, which is divided into several phases, is dated to around 14,000 to 300 BC. No less exciting is the fact that the Kami Okanushi were known as the god of construction and was also admired for his secret knowledge and extraordinary healing skills. And isn't it amazing that we also find this wisdom symbolism in many other deities from completely different corners of the world? Just think of Krikraps from the Greek mythology. The hybrid of man and dragon is regarded as the founder of Athens, who introduced marriage, the first state institutions, and property rights. On the other side of the world, in Mesoamerica to be precise, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl took on a similar role in Mesopotamia. Oannes was considered to be the first bringer of culture. However, it seems that not every gift of civilization was intended to be handed over in its entirety. The local Shinto myth, for example, reports that Okanushi was in the process of creating a magnificent monument, the foundation stone of which was Hisho no Hoden. However, after the first piece was completed, a bloody riot broke out, forcing the kami to turn away from his construction and ultimately leave it unfinished. Heavier. The monoliths enthroned in the quarry of Baalbek, located in present-day Lebanon, the massive colossi are considered to be the largest known stone blocks from ancient times. The Pregnant Woman's Stone and its two unnamed counterparts weigh around 1,000, 1,240, and 1,650 tons respectively. And the Romans are said to have planned to move the monoliths to the nearby temple district to incorporate them into the foundations of their shrines. However, exactly how the stones were to be transported remains a historical mystery. But perhaps it was their sheer size that ensured that the oversized blocks remained in place forever. A perfectly understandable explanation, but on closer inspection it raises even more questions. If the Romans failed to transport the stones of Baalbek in this case, how did they manage it another time? The Temple of Jupiter, mentioned at the beginning, is enthroned on the so-called Trilithon, and thus on a podium that contains 3 stone blocks, each weighing 800 tons. However, the Romans must not only have managed to somehow bring the stone giants to their intended location, but also to place them on a layer of blocks weighing 350 tons each. But were the Romans really the ones who created this awe-inspiring podium? Well, some alternative thinkers believe that the gigantic foundations of Baalbek were already completed when the Roman builders arrived there. By implication, they would have merely placed their magnificent buildings on the existing structure. But whether the Romans did it or not, someone must have created these monumental objects thousands of years ago and then integrated them into a larger structure. There is no question that lifting an 800-ton structure was a challenging task, to say the least, but there is also no question that 800 tons is nothing compared to 3,000 tons. The mystery of the Granaya Sharia megaliths. The 3 blocks of the trilithon weigh 2,400 tons in total. On the one hand, that is about as much as 16 blue whales. And on the other hand, it is still less than the estimated weight of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths. This is estimated at around 3,000 tons, and that is per single stone block. And just to be clear, we are not talking about a few loosely scattered blocks here, but rather about a kind of continuous wall that is over 200 meters long and consists of stones that are on average 20 meters long. Now, there are 2 ways to approach this impressive structure. In the region of mountain shrines, located in southern Siberia, the conservative researchers emphasize that we are dealing here with a purely natural structure, the creation of which requires neither the existence of a lost civilization nor the use of prehistoric high technology. More precisely, the megaliths form the ridges and summit of the 1,200-meter-high mountain Kulium, and they result from a combination of various geological processes and the intense weathering of the rock. On the other hand, however, there is the assumption that they are by no means just a rocky whim of nature, but clear evidence that our ancestors achieved technological milestones that we dare not even dream of today. And anyone who delves a little into the mystery of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths will sooner or later come across the name Georgy Sidorov. He discovered the structures in 2013 and was immediately deeply impressed by its dimensions and design. Sidorov emphasized that the structure is comparable to the splendor of the Egyptian pyramids. Furthermore, there are even circular drill holes and some traces of melting. But that's not all. When Sidorov and his companions inspected the site, their compasses also reportedly went haywire. In line with this, the researchers suspected a, quote, negative geomagnetic field that suggests advanced ancient knowledge. Those who actually believe that the Gornaya Sharia megaliths are a man-made structure therefore consider it possible, on this basis, that their creators harnessed forces that far exceed our modern understanding. Apart from that, the situation also raises more questions than it answers. After all, why on earth would someone build a monumental structure in such a harsh environment? And what purpose did the structure serve in the first place? The work of a lost civilization? The task of heaving countless stone blocks weighing thousands of tons on top of a remote mountain would probably push even our modern construction equipment to its limits. And with the knowledge that the age of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths is estimated to be at least 10,000 years old, a simple yet profound question arises. How could this have been possible at all? Well, to understand this, we have to delve a little deeper into the highly controversial field of fringe science. And bear in mind that many alternative researchers believe in the existence of a highly developed but completely forgotten advanced civilization that was wiped out at the end of the last ice age by a severe flood disaster. Afterwards, however, the few survivors of the apocalypse succeeded in going out to the rest of the world and bringing the simpler peoples the gift of civilization. This is also the reason why so many different cultures tell the story of an all-destroying flood, from which higher beings emerged, and why we find gigantic stone structures like the pyramids or the Gornaya Sharia megaliths in all corners of the world. But it gets even more controversial. Where the skills of our ancestors end, some people think it more likely that the colossal structure was actually created by actual giants or aliens. We probably don't need to emphasize at this point that such theories are not really welcomed with open arms in the rest of the research world. But what about the question of the suspected purpose? Well, assuming that we are really dealing with an artificial formation here, it could be a site that once became the focus of religious or ceremonial rituals. Alternatively, the formation could have served as a site for astronomical observations. But the list of speculations does not end there. Some people even associate the megaliths with the abdominal snowman, which is said to have been sighted several times in the region. But before we get too lost in the world of mythical creatures, we should stick to the established facts, and these say that a previously completely unknown relative of man was discovered near the stone giant. The legacy of the Denisova man? A small bone, a big sensation. After experts analyzed the DNA from the mitochondria of a tiny finger bone in 2010, there was no longer any doubt that the Homo genus had a new population. The groundbreaking fossil was discovered in a cave in the Altai Mountains in southern Siberia. Later, the lower jaw of the Denisova human was also found in Tibet. And while the latter dates back 160,000 years, the bones recovered in the Siberian cave are between 76,000 and 52,000 years old. That being said, our knowledge of Denisova humans is, to put it mildly, limited. And you can probably already guess where the alternative journey goes from here. Because although there is no evidence for it, some people believe that the megaliths were created neither by nature nor by our species, but by the Denisova humans. After all, the remains of threads and beads have already been found in Denisova Cave in 2021, which would clearly show that the Denisova people were significantly more advanced than previously thought. However, there is a small but subtle difference between making a string of beads and creating a monument made of stones weighing 3,000 tons.
The mystery of Baalbek. Baalbek, in modern-day Lebanon, is an ancient settlement that once stood at a major crossroads of caravan routes from the north, east, and south. Over the millennia, Baalbek has been inhabited and transformed by many cultures and peoples. After the biblical Canaanites came the Greeks under Alexander the Great, then the Romans. All these cultures had chosen a very special place for their temples and places of worship, a hill called Heliopolis by Alexander the Great. To this day, the ruins of the sanctuaries of the Romans lie there. Among the most stately structures were a temple dedicated to Jupiter and one to honor Bacchus, the god of pleasure and wine. At first glance, these temple ruins look like many others of the Romans: foundations of stone, columns, chunks of stone lying around, and remains of figures of gods. Nevertheless, the temple complex of Baalbek holds an as-yet unsolved mystery. The foundations of the Temple of Jupiter contain 3 stone blocks known as the Trilithon. These stone blocks, 19 meters long and 6 meters wide, weigh 800 tons each and are processed so smoothly that no sheet of paper would find room in the joints. In the Baalbek quarry, researchers found the 3 other stone giants. Although they never left the quarry, these are considered to be the largest stone monuments ever created and moved by humans. The Pregnant Woman's Stone, the Stone of the South, and the Forgotten Stone each weigh over 1,000 tons. And it remains a mystery to this day how these stones could have been made and moved. We have already dealt with these 3 stones in detail in another video. Today, we look at another mystery of Baalbek, and these are the stone columns. 100 columns from Aswan to Baalbek? Today, the 6 Corinthian columns still standing are Baalbek's landmark. Once, they were part of the Temple of Jupiter, which was enclosed by a total of 54 columns of this type. These columns are special. They are the largest erected in ancient times. Each column is 22.6 meters high, and the diameter is 2.2 meters. Thus, these columns tower over the world-famous monuments of the Acropolis in Athens by over 2 times. Unlike the Trilithon, the columns were not built from a single stone, but were assembled from perfectly worked individual parts. The really amazing thing about this monument is the origin of the stone. Today, we know with certainty that the rose granite comes from a quarry near Aswan, and this is, as you probably immediately recognize correctly, in Egypt. To clarify here immediately the scales, Baalbek is about 1,444 kilometers away from Aswan today. At least, that's what Google Maps says, which today, of course, uses roads that are paved and can be driven on by cars. The Temple of Jupiter was built in Baalbek in the 2nd or 3rd century AD. In the Roman Empire, there were very well something like roads, carts, and certainly a lot of beasts of burden. Nevertheless, the transport of a quantity of stone like this one resembles a miracle. Not only the material for 54 columns of the Temple of Jupiter was transported from Aswan to Baalbek, but also further components for the approximately 50 columns of the Temple of Bacchus. The load of the stone has amounted to several thousand tons. The stone of the pregnant woman, which we have already shown you at the beginning of the video, weighs a little more than 1,000 tons. Here, we show you a picture of a model in Jungfrauenpark Park in Interlaken, Switzerland, which shows the force that would be needed today to lift 1,000 tons. Now, you can imagine the forces needed to transport stone loads weighing several thousand tons over a distance of 1,440 kilometers. If you've ever seen a Roman road, you know that they were simple cobblestone roads with potholes, grooves, and gaps between the stones. How could the Romans have managed this? There's evidence that the Romans had sophisticated lifting and pulling systems. The way they worked has survived in a few documents. The Roman architect and engineer, Vitruvius, described the pulley system in these words: 2 beams are required for the jib, the thickness of which depends on the maximum load expected. They are connected at the top with an iron stirrup and divided at the bottom like an inverted V. At the head of the boom are attached ropes, which are arranged all around to keep it stable. A pulley is suspended from the top. This relief, found on Via Cassia in Italy, shows the technique being operated by 2 men exactly. It can be used to explain how the stones were hoisted onto carts. It can also explain how the components were placed on top of each other to form columns in Baalbek. Nevertheless, it seems almost impossible to critical minds that the Romans transported stones weighing several hundred tons over such a long distance. It is also a mystery why rose granite had to be used at this place, when stones of other qualities would have been available from quarries far closer. Nevertheless, the stone columns of the temples of Jupiter and Bacchus do not necessarily contradict the human possibilities of the Romans to such an extent that we have to think about the work of extraterrestrials. What can be ruled out with a fair degree of certainty, however, is that the Romans moved the 3 stone giants of the Trilithon. If you've already seen our other new video on the subject, you may already know that there is testimony that the Romans were overwhelmed with transporting the obelisk of Karnak. It wasn't until Emperor Constantine the Great had the obelisk cut down that it could be brought towards Constantinople. The obelisk weighs a maximum of 500 tons and took several years to complete its journey. The stones of the Trilithon in the foundation of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, however, weigh at least 800 tons and have thus far exceeded the heavy load capacity of the Romans. The mystery of the giant stone blocks. To this day, researchers also wonder why the 3 giant stones were left in the Baalbek quarry. There are 3 theories. Number 1. The stones could have proved to be too heavy and therefore remained lying down. 2. The stones were components of a much larger monument, far before the Roman time, but this one could not be finished. 3. The stones were rejects, broken or inappropriately cut out of the stone. If the stones had really been too heavy to transport, the builders who created them would have reduced the size of the stones and surely used them elsewhere. Once such a block is cut out of the quarry, it is not simply left lying around. This explanation also fits the argument that the stones could have been rejects. Since many of the smaller stone blocks were used in the foundations of Baalbek and in the temples, the workers would certainly have cut them up. While there is currently no real evidence that the foundation under the Temple of Jupiter is much older than the Roman period, it is often speculated that this is precisely the case. Not only the foundation of the temple complex of Baalbek contained stones that were actually much too large to have been transported in ancient times. The phenomenon is also found in the pyramids of Egypt and the so-called Forgotten Pyramid of Baka. And strangely enough, the special rose granite of Aswan was also used in each case. What these structures also have in common is that their true age and intended use are difficult to determine. It is conceivable that the pyramids and the temple foundations of Baalbek are 10,000 years old or more, possibly the work of an unknown culture. Of course, friends of unusual phenomena have often rumored that Baalbek could have been a kind of landing plateau for spaceships. However, this is rather improbable alone from the statistics and the size of the platform. Also, what do we know already about landing places for spaceships? Let's leave these theories aside and look at more natural approaches, where this stone gigantism comes from, and how to explain that people in ancient times were able to transport stones over long distances, where we would struggle today with all of our technology. Here too, there are several approaches. Since evidence has now surfaced around the world that the human race may have produced advanced civilizations long before antiquity and Egyptian antiquity, It is possible that one such civilization was responsible for the construction of the Trilithon at Baalbek. Time and again, it is amazing to see how similar buildings are in this world, created by cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. At the temple entrance of Baalbek, the trapezoidal shape can be found, which is not necessarily indicative of the temple construction of the Romans. However, the shape was found in Inca buildings and in Egypt. Contacts between Egyptians and Romans are clear, but how is it that pyramids and trapezoids were also built on the South American continent? Alternative researchers point out again and again that there is a connection between the buildings, which the old established archaeology and natural sciences do not want us to see. We must also be aware at this point that archaeology has only been around for about 200 years. In this time, a lot has been excavated, and we have learned a lot about the preceding cultures. Nevertheless, we can by no means know everything and have not found everything that lies dormant somewhere in the earth. Inexplicable monuments, like the Trilithon or the Sphinx, admonish us to keep our minds open and to be aware of always trying to explain everything with known facts. Also, science must leave room for new things. Who could have been at work in Baalbek? We do not know in the end.
If you want to see the archaeological site of Tinawanku with your own eyes, you need a lot of stamina. After all, at 3,850 meters above sea level, the air can confidently be described as thin. Part of Pumapunku Tinawanku is located in the Alaplano Plateau near Lake Titicaca, and thus officially belongs to an artificially created platform hill. But a quick glance at its terraced layout, its equally ingenious and massive canals, and not least its imposing monumental structures, which have long since been destroyed, proves that this description does not really do justice to the genius behind the creation of the complex. And yet, it is not only the dizzying height, we are talking about one of the highest urban centers in the world, that makes Pumapunku so unique. No, because the architecture used here has no known precedent in the entire Andes. And while the corresponding stone blocks were so intricately crafted that they are a mystery even to modern stonemasons, we cannot even say with absolute certainty who created the site in the first place. In fact, the relevant specialist text reports on several different cultures that used Tinawanku as a religious and political center between 1500 BC and 1200 AD. In this regard, experts assume that the Tinawanku state existed for about 2,000 years. And during this time, as it developed southeast of Lake Titicaca, it probably reached an extent of over 500,000 square kilometers in its heyday and provided a home for around 500,000 people. And in view of these dimensions, it is practically obvious that the Tinawanku culture has not only immortalized its heritage in Pumapunku, in fact, this ancient people also managed to develop effective irrigation systems that covered an area of more than 80 square kilometers and ensured the stable cultivation of essential crops such as potatoes, corn, and quinoa. It seems that the Tinawanku culture suddenly disappeared around the year 1000 AD, and we don't know the definite answer to the question of what led to this abrupt demise. One theory is based on the assumption that the culture succumbed to a severe drought, and since its members were no longer able to maintain food crops as a result, the community fragmented and eventually sank completely into the shadows of the past. The mystery of the H blocks. A different century, the same mystery. While the architectural wonders of Tinawanku are still shrouded in many questions to this day, the Spanish conquistadors also wondered how the stone monuments could be hewn out of the ground at all. Specifically, the Spaniards in the 16th century simply could not explain how such massive stones could be transported and then shaped into such extraordinary forms. The fact that the situation is not much different in its basic features over 500 years later is again due to the fact that Tinawanku no longer has anything to do with its original appearance. And by that, we really mean nothing. Since Tinawanku is one of the most looted and destroyed sites in all of South America, none of the monolith blocks are still in their original place. In fact, the structures were only rebuilt afterwards, and some historians estimate that this has only further deepened the architectural mystery. There was simply no basis for the reconstruction, and it would have been a very big coincidence if the efforts of modern times had hit the exact core of antiquity. But even if we leave aside the correct arrangement of the structures for a moment, one thing is indisputable. Many components of Pumapunku and Tiahuanaco seem so mysterious that they immediately leave us with raised eyebrows. Take a closer look at the so-called H blocks. As the name suggests, they are shaped like the letter from which they take their name. However, they also have ridiculously straight edges and are sometimes exactly 1 meter high. In view of this, the alternative camp wonders whether these mysterious testimonies were really only made with primitive hand tools, or whether some kind of laser cutting technology was not used after all. By the way, pre-astronauticists like Eric von Daniken also think they know exactly who brought our ancestors the corresponding technologies, but more about that in a moment. In any case, it is clear that the H-shaped blocks of Pumapunku are no exception. No matter where we look, we are met with amazing stone carvings that testify to the extraordinary skills of their creators. And while the so-called arrow stones, or the blocks with the typical Andean crosses, also amaze us, we must not forget that some of the structures are gigantic. For example, the researchers at Pumapunku have already discovered a monolith that is over 7.8 meters long and weighs an incredible 130 tons. In this regard, the material analysis has shown that the Colossus was brought from a quarry 10 kilometers away. But how exactly did people accomplish this hundreds of years ago? Well, even the experts can only offer theories in this regard, but it is thought likely that a combination of ramps, ropes, and sheer muscle power was used. The work of aliens? Oh yes. But what about the image on the Tiahuanaco Sun Gate, which clearly shows an alien and thus proves that the inhabitants of ancient times were regularly visited by extraterrestrial intelligences? Well, a dyed-in-the-wool pre-astronaut would probably react to these of conservative historians in one of these ways or another. As already briefly mentioned, the not entirely uncontroversial author and alternative researcher Eric von Daniken is firmly convinced that the Sun Gate does not show us a figure on a pedestal, as is commonly claimed, but an extraterrestrial being floating in a spaceship. But that's not all. The inscriptions on the gable of the structure also would leave no doubt that the creature once came to Earth on board a flying saucer. However, the other side emphasizes that this interpretation is absolutely far-fetched and lacks any serious basis. Despite all this, however, von Daniken's followers continue to believe that what is written in our history books has nothing to do with historical reality. After all, there is a reason why so many different cultures of the past had a cult of the gods that revolved around heavenly beings who revealed higher knowledge to the inhabitants of the earth. As you can probably already guess, these gods are said to have been extraterrestrial in the flesh. But since our ancestors were unable to explain the futuristic technologies of their visitors, they were simply given a supernatural background. This 3D model aims to put an end to alien speculation. But now we find ourselves in the comfortable situation of being able to examine the mysteries of days long gone in a completely different way. And so it came about that a group of scientists from the University of California in Los Angeles set out to create the first 3D model of Pumapunku, and in doing so, to verify whether the site is really as unusual and unique as is often said to be. Before they could do that, however, the researchers had to gather all the information about Pumapunku that had been collected over the last 150 years. With the help of notes, descriptions, images, and finds, the experts reconstructed almost everything that had been discovered about the site so far, and, according to them, provided clear evidence that the claims of the pre-astronauticians are false. After all, the final, true-to-scale 3D print shows that Pumapunku does not really break with tradition as dramatically as previously assumed. Quite the opposite. In their study, the researchers demonstrated that the design used here can even be found in 2 other nearby sites. But how could the researchers be so sure? Because just like Tiahuanaco, Pumapunku was also devastated beyond repair in the course of the past, and as already mentioned, we don't actually know of any other example in the entire Andes region that we could use for orientation. Well, sometimes the solution to the puzzle is simply called intuition. After the experts had made the 150 individual parts of the site, their size, shape, and thickness practically showed by themselves how they had to be put together correctly. And where the tactile nature of the components met the intuitive inspiration of the experts, a kind of 3D puzzle was created that finally showed Pumapunku in its original form. Well, that's true for one side at least. Whether Von Daniken and company would also let themselves be converted by this, to put it casually, scientific tinkering session is, of course, a completely different matter. It's also a completely different question as to why you haven't clicked on the subscribe button yet. I'm happy to make up for that now, and you'll never miss a new video from us again in the future. See you soon!